He gave everything he had for the woman he loved, but in return, he only got suffering. However, what he did next shocked everyone. Hello. Welcome. Like, subscribe, and activate notifications. It was a slow afternoon at the hospital where social worker Caroline worked. However, an elderly man arrived at the hospital accompanied by a staff member from a nursing home. The man was very nervous. He didn't want to be there, but he had an injury on his leg and a cut on his hand. He was seen by a doctor and had to stay overnight for observation. This made the man even more nervous, as he wanted to leave immediately. But with no choice, he stayed. At night, Caroline was on duty and everything was very calm, until a noise came from that same man's room. She was called to see what happened, and found the same man removing his IV and trying to leave the room. But the nurses stopped him. She told him he couldn't leave, that the doctor would only discharge him in the morning. The man tried to argue with her, saying he had a very important place to go. But Caroline said his health was the most important thing at that moment. The man calmed down a bit. He was silent for a few moments. Caroline looked at his name on the medical record. His name was John. She noticed he was very sad and started talking to John. This seemed to calm him. Caroline asked Mr. John what was so important that he had to leave the hospital in the middle of the night. He said she wouldn't understand, as it was a long story. However, she said she had plenty of time to hear his whole story. John took a deep breath and began to speak. Many years ago, when John was young, his parents were very humble, and even being an only child, there was always something missing at home. So, he had to start working early. They got him a job at a barber shop, but as he knew nothing about cutting hair, they put him to work shining the customers' shoes. The job itself didn't pay very well, but the tips supplemented his salary and helped with his upkeep. One man in particular came every week. He had the most expensive shoes that stepped there, and always gave good tips to John. But what was most enchanting was his daughter. He fell in love with her the moment he saw her, but knew he never stood a chance with her. Unfortunately, one day the barbershop where he worked had to close. The same rich man, who always went there, offered him a job at his house. Not wanting to be unemployed, he accepted immediately. John worked for a few years at his house as a gardener and saw his daughter, his passion, every day. Her name was Mary. She was always very polite to him, but John never let anything show, as he knew his place, and also couldn't risk losing his job. One day while he was working, John heard an argument inside the house. Mary was pregnant with twins, and to make matters worse, the father of the children had disappeared when he found out about her pregnancy. Mary's father and mother were furious and said she would have to end the pregnancy, as it was a shame to have a pregnant and single daughter at that time. Mary shouted that she would never do that, and that even against their will she would have those children. Her father was very angry and said that she was no longer his daughter and that she could leave the house. Mary's mother was furious too, but not to the point of expelling her daughter from home. However, she always obeyed her husband and did not go against his word. That same day, Mary left home. Mary's mother gave her a lot of money so she could follow her life. As she left, John followed her, and after a while she simply stopped and started to cry. He couldn't resist and went to talk to her. Mary said she didn't know where to go and what to do with her life. John said he would help her, and together they looked for a furnished place for her to live. It wasn't difficult to find, as she had a lot of money her mother had given her. John and Mary became friends over time, and although he was in love with her, he never said anything. As John still worked as a gardener at her parents' house, Mary asked him to deliver a letter to her mother. He was afraid to do it, as he could lose his job, but he would do anything for her. The next day, John gave the letter to Mary's mother, who cried and immediately handed him her necklace. At that moment, he understood what was in the letter. Mary must have been asking her for money. Mary pawned the necklace and got enough money to live for a few more months. However, from that day on, Mary's mother began to give John some small jewelry, money, and even food. Thus, Mary was able to have a more comfortable life. But one day, Mary's mother said that John could no longer come back. Her husband had discovered what they were doing, and only God knows what he would do to him. So John never returned. Mary was desolate and didn't know how she would sustain herself. But God was good to them, and soon John got a job as a shoe shiner elsewhere. He helped her with what he could, but at that time he was living alone and couldn't afford 2 rents. John talked to her, and very calmly she said she would accept to live with him. John was sad and happy at the same time, sad about her situation, but happy to have her close to him, even if just as friends. A few months later, Mary gave birth to 2 beautiful twins. She named them Raphael and Cassiel, as they were angels in her life. John worked and Mary took care of the house. They lived like a couple, but were just friends. However, Mary became more affectionate with him, and one day, unexpectedly, she kissed him. That was the happiest day of John's life. They finally became a couple, but raising 2 children was not easy. Mary also got a job to improve their situation. For 5 years, they lived like this. John was happy, and thought Mary was happy with him. But Raphael and Cassiel suffered a lot due to their financial condition. They didn't eat properly, and Cassiel even went to the hospital once because he was malnourished. This situation made John sad, not being able to provide for them. And because of this, the worst day of John's life happened. Mary would leave the house with Raphael and Cassiel. She was honest and said she had an affair with another man and that she would live with him. John was terrified when she said this. He loved her more than himself. However, she was crying and said goodbye with a kiss. She also asked him never to follow her. John felt an emptiness in his life that, to him, no longer had meaning. He spent months, years suffering and never managed to forget her, but he had to move on. John began to study a lot to improve his life and handed out resumes everywhere. In 2 years, his life changed. He wasn't rich, far from it, but he had a peaceful life. Yet the emptiness that Mary left in his chest never disappeared. For 2 years, he knew nothing about her whereabouts. For 2 years, he suffered greatly. But one day, while out for a walk, John saw her. She was as beautiful as ever, wearing a dress that seemed quite expensive. Raphael and Cassiel were also with her, looking unrecognizable, much stronger, and wearing clothes that seemed too good for him to afford. With her was a man, but he was holding hands with her. Looking at them, John realized that they had a lot of money, which made him feel both sad and happy. She seemed to have a wonderful life, and he understood why she had left him. Her children were well, and as a mother, her priority was the children. But John couldn't help feeling sad that she wasn't by his side. He couldn't resist and went to talk to her. Mary became nervous when he approached. She introduced John as a work colleague and then introduced her husband to him. The children seemed puzzled, but followed what their mother said and acted as if they didn't know him, or perhaps they had already forgotten the 5 years they spent together. Mary told her husband to take the children ahead and that she would join them soon. Once they were alone, she became nervous and said he shouldn't have come. John was irritated and questioned everything she had put him through. Mary looked sad and touched his face. In a sad voice, she said she did what she had to do for her children and that he should not come to see her again. John cried for several days. He couldn't feel anger towards her. Deep down, he felt that they were better off without him. Decades passed, and he never saw her again or heard anything about her. John worked for years until he retired. He never had children and never fell in love again. He had several girlfriends over the years, but never felt complete. However, fate made their paths cross again. One day, John was in the park, just strolling with nothing to do that day. He saw an elderly woman in the same park. Despite the decades that had passed, he couldn't believe that the woman he was seeing was her, as she looked very much like Mary. He immediately went to talk to her, but the woman did not recognize him. She seemed confused and did not even say her name. Soon after, a young woman came to talk to John. She worked in a nursing home, and they were taking several elderly people for a walk in the park. The young woman asked if he knew the elderly lady. But John said no, he had mistaken her for someone from his past. The young woman then told him that the elderly woman was in the nursing home because she was found on the street, aimless, without documents, and no one ever came looking for her. They called her Sophia, and she probably had Alzheimer's. She had been in that nursing home for 3 years. While the young woman took care of other elderly people, John talked to the lady. But nothing she said made sense. However, 2 boys were playing ball near them, kicked the ball, and hit his leg. He told them to be careful, and handed the ball back to them. At that moment, The lady next to him uttered two words that made him cry. Cassiel, Raphael. His heart filled with joy. It was her, his beloved. However, John wanted to know how she ended up there and needed to get her out. He took the nursing home's card and told her companion that he would bring a relative who could prove who she was. For days he searched for any information about her children, parents, or husband. Her parents had died 20 years ago, and he found nothing about her children or husband. Unable to take her out of there, he decided to go to the nursing home on his own. Since then, it's been a year that he's been living there. Even though she doesn't remember him, he remembers her. They have lunch together every day, dine together, and even watch TV together. Although she doesn't talk much, occasionally she mentions something from the past, but Mary seems not to recognize him. Yesterday she was very nervous and tried to run away. John ran after her, which is why he fell. They forcibly took John to the hospital, but all he wanted to know was how she was. Caroline, the social worker, was moved to hear John's story. She couldn't imagine how, even after all these years, he could still love Mary, despite her leaving him for another man and disappearing from his life. Caroline took the name of the nursing home and called to inquire about Sophia, as they called Mary. To her and John's relief, Mary was fine. She hadn't managed to escape. The next day, John was discharged, but Caroline spoke to him. She said that as soon as she could, she would visit the nursing home and try to help him find some of Mary's relatives so they could find out what happened to her. Caroline kept her promise and visited them. She thought they made a beautiful couple, even though they only treated each other as friends. She tried to talk to Mary, but she didn't remember anything, so she asked John for all the addresses and names of people close to him that he could remember. Caroline did what she could, but she couldn't find anything. She gave the bad news to John, who was very sad. He said he would spend the rest of his life by her side, as long as he breathed, and that it didn't matter if no one appeared. He would take care of her just as he did when she was expelled from her home. At that moment, John remembered the old house where he lived with Mary for 5 years. He said it was in another city not too far away, and asked if Caroline could go there to ask the neighbors if they knew anything. Caroline agreed, as she was fully committed to discovering what happened to Mary. She went to the other city and looked for John's old address. However, on the way, she saw a missing person poster on a pole. It was a photo of Mary. Caroline took the number and met the person who posted the poster. At the nursing home, John was helping Mary eat her soup when Caroline arrived with a man. This man ran to hug Mary and called her mother. John smiled, seeing finally one of Mary's children had appeared. He hugged Mary, who still didn't seem to recognize him. John was curious to know if this was Cassiel or Raphael, but let mother and son have their moment. Carolina told John how she found the man. When Caroline introduced John to the man, he seemed emotional. He introduced himself as Luke. John was surprised, as he didn't know Mary had another child. Luke said he knew who John was because his mother talked a lot about him. John began to cry, as the mere fact that she spoke about him made him happy. Luke told everything his mother had told him. After leaving John, Mary had a good life where money was not lacking, but she always seemed sad. Her husband died young, and although he appeared rich, he had many debts, so the inheritance he left for Mary was little. However, with a lot of work, she managed to raise her 3 children, Cassiel, Raphael, and Luke. Cassiel and Raphael, as they grew, followed their own paths. Both managed to get jobs abroad, so they barely spoke to their mother and half-brother. However, Luke never left his mother's side. When Mary became elderly, she started showing signs that she was not mentally well. At this time, she began to talk a lot about John. Luke listened to everything she said, how he helped her, all the harm she had done to him, and how she wanted to speak to him again, as she wanted to ask for his forgiveness and never stopped loving him, but had to make a difficult choice to give her children a better life. John couldn't stop crying and thanked Luke for telling him all this. John said he was happy that Luke's father was able to give them a decent life. At that moment, Luke said that the man his mother married was not his father. With tears in his eyes, Luke said one of Mary's last words before she forgot her past. Mary was already pregnant when she left John. With 2 children, the situation was already difficult, so with 3, it would be even worse. However, a very rich man courted Mary at work and wanted to marry her. Not proudly and with great sadness, Mary decided to leave John's house and live with the other man, so he would think that the child she was carrying in her womb was his and not John's. Luke was actually John's son. Both cried as they hugged each other. Mary looked at the two of them and, although she didn't show much reaction, a tear fell from her eye. Luke took his mother out of the nursing home and brought her back to her house. John was going to look for a place to live, as the nursing home made no sense without Mary there. But Luke invited him to live with them, as he was his father. John accepted with great happiness. In the end, John gained a son he didn't know he had, and was able to take care of his eternal beloved. One day, Luke was washing dishes and John was feeding soup to Mary. John noticed that Mary kept looking at him. He then caressed her face as a gesture of affection. She then spoke, "I love you."